Cold cases remain silent for years, sometimes decades, but silence doesn't erase the truth. It only waits. In 1974, a 17-year-old girl vanished from a parking lot in Fort Worth, Texas. Her name was Carla Walker. For nearly half a century, her story was frozen in time. No answers, no justice, no voice. Until science, determination, and one unexpected piece of evidence uncovered the truth behind a mystery that refused to die. This is the story of how a 46-year-old cold case finally broke open. Welcome to Cold Case Stories. It was a soft February evening in 1974. The kind of night that felt calm, familiar, safe. Fort Worth, Texas, a city growing, yet still holding the warmth of a small community. Teenagers filled the streets around Western Hills High School, excited, laughing, carrying the feeling that nothing bad could ever happen to them. Among them was 17-year-old Carla Walker, a cheerleader, a daughter, a sister, a girl who lit up every room she entered. People who knew her said Carla never raised her voice, never spoke badly about anyone, and always seemed to care more about others than about herself. On February 17th, Carla attended the Valentine's dance with her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy. The dance was filled with music and balloons, and the kind of nervous excitement that only teenagers understand. Carla wore a light blue dress. Rodney later said she looked beautiful, but more than that, she looked happy. After the dance ended, they weren't ready to go home. Not yet. So they drove to the Ridgelea Bowl, a popular bowling alley where many local teens went to talk, to hang out, or to sit in their cars and enjoy a few quiet minutes together. The parking lot was dim, lit only by a handful of buzzing yellow lights. Rodney parked the car. They talked about the dance, about school, about plans for the weekend. Moments that seemed small at the time, but would become the final memories Rodney would ever have of Carla. Then everything changed. A man appeared at the passenger door. No warning, no sound, just a shadow that ripped into their world. He grabbed the handle, yanked the door open, and before Rodney could turn or breathe, the man struck him across the face with what felt like a heavy pistol. Rodney collapsed sideways, eyes flickering, barely conscious. The last thing he heard was Carla screaming, "Rodney! He's going to kill me!" And then her voice disappeared into the night. When Rodney woke again, he was alone, bleeding, dizzy, confused. Carla was gone. He stumbled out of the car, desperate, calling her name, looking into the dark parking lot for any sign of her. But she was nowhere. 3 days later, Carla's body was discovered in a culvert near Benbrook Lake. The news tore through Fort Worth like a storm. People who had never met her wept as if they had lost someone they loved. Carla's parents collapsed when they heard the words. Her brother said he felt the world shift beneath his feet. And Rodney carried a weight he would hold for the rest of his life. Police launched one of the largest investigations the city had ever seen. Officers searched fields, interviewed teenagers, knocked on doors, and questioned anyone who owned a .22 caliber Ruger pistol, the type believed to be used during the attack. But in 1974, technology was painfully limited. There was no DNA testing, no genetic genealogy, no digital fingerprint databases, not even surveillance cameras to show who walked through a parking lot or drove away into the night. Everything relied on witness testimony, fragments of memory, and sometimes just luck. Detectives questioned a number of men in the area, including someone who lived not far from Carla. He said he owned a .22 Ruger, but claimed it had been stolen. Police couldn't prove otherwise. With no evidence tying him to the crime, he was dismissed. Not because he was innocent, but because 1974 simply didn't have the tools to reveal the truth. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. And the case of Carla Walker slowly faded from the headlines and sank into the shadows of the police archives. Carla's parents visited detectives every year, asking if there was any hope, any new lead, any reason to keep believing. But every answer was the same. No progress, no suspects, no idea. Her mother died without ever knowing what happened to her daughter. Her father passed still waiting for justice, still waiting for the truth. And Carla's brother would later say, "I lived with anger for decades, anger at the world, anger at whoever did this, and anger at time, because time took everything from my family." For 45 years, Carla's case sat in a dusty box in a quiet archive room, unopened, unanswered, unsolved, until science and determination finally caught up with the truth. 45 years after Carla's murder, a new generation of detectives began reviewing old cases with fresh eyes and new technology. By 2019, DNA science had evolved far beyond what anyone in 1974 could have imagined. Forensic genealogy had solved dozens of cold cases across the United States. It had identified serial killers, kidnappers, and murderers who once seemed untouchable. The Fort Worth Police Department made a decision. Carla's case deserved one last chance. Detectives reopened the file. They removed the old photographs. They unfolded yellowed documents. They laid out every piece of evidence on a long metal table. And they contacted Othram, a cutting-edge private laboratory specializing in advanced DNA reconstruction. For the first time in decades, Carla's case had momentum. Othram received the evidence. Clothing that had been stored for nearly half a century, fabric worn by time, fibers fragile enough to crumble under strong light. But their scientists were experts at finding something where almost nothing remained. Using advanced extraction and whole genome sequencing, they searched through microscopic traces, material so small that even a single cell could change the direction of history. Days turned into weeks. Weeks became months. And then they found something, a partial DNA profile. Not perfect, not complete, but enough. Enough to build a genetic fingerprint that could be used in genealogical databases. Analysts began constructing a family tree one branch at a time. They traced distant cousins, then closer cousins, then great-uncles, and finally, a direct line. All paths kept leading back to one family and to one man, a name that detectives recognized from the earliest days of the 1974 investigation. Glenn Samuel McCurley. A man who lived less than a mile from Carla's home. A man whose timeline matched the night of the attack. A man who owned a .22 caliber Ruger pistol, the same weapon type involved in the assault on Rodney and the abduction of Carla. And yet, he had slipped through the cracks for decades. Back then, police had questioned him briefly. He said his gun was stolen. With no way to check, detectives let him go. Now, 45 years later, science placed him squarely back in the center of the case. But DNA from the evidence was only half the puzzle. Detectives needed his DNA to confirm the connection. They watched him, quietly, patiently, carefully. He was 77 years old, thin, slow-moving, living a quiet life in a modest Texas home. Detectives followed him as he ran errands, as he drove to the store, as he walked alone. Then, one day, McCurley purchased a soda. He stepped outside, took a sip, and tossed the cup into a public trash bin. It was the moment detectives had been waiting for. They retrieved the cup, bagged it, labeled it, and sent it to the lab. Days later, the results arrived. A perfect match. The DNA left on Carla's clothing in 1974 belonged to Glenn Samuel McCurley. After 46 years, Carla Walker finally had her answer. Police prepared for the arrest. But when they arrived, McCurley was calm, almost gentle. Detectives told him that DNA linked him to the crime. At first, he denied it. He said he didn't know Carla, had never seen her, had nothing to do with it. But as detectives continued, his voice softened, his eyes lowered. And then, almost in a whisper, he said the words that shattered nearly 5 decades of silence. Yes, I was there. For the first time since 1974, the truth had a name. The past finally had a face, and Carla Walker was no longer just a cold case file. She was a girl whose story was finally being heard again. Detectives transported McCurley to the Fort Worth Police Department for questioning. He sat in a small, dimly lit room, the same kind of room where so many suspects had once been interviewed in the years following Carla's death. But now, time had caught up with him. The man who once overpowered a teenage couple in a dark parking lot was now an elderly figure with fragile hands and a trembling voice. Detectives showed him the DNA results. They explained the scientific process that linked him to Carla with a certainty that could not be dismissed. McCurley looked down at the table, at the silver handcuffs, at the reflection of the overhead lamp shining on the metal surface. He let out a long breath, and his shoulders lowered as if a weight he had carried for decades had finally become too heavy. He repeated quietly, "I was there." But he didn't offer details. No confession, no explanation. Just a soft acknowledgement that confirmed what the DNA had already proven. Detectives charged him with the capital murder of Carla John Walker. The news spread across Fort Worth. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse. People who remembered the case from their youth stood in stunned silence. Some cried, some prayed. Some whispered that they had never expected to see justice in their lifetime. For Carla's family, the arrest felt both surreal and heartbreaking. Her brother said, "It felt like she finally spoke." But the journey wasn't over yet. In 2021, the trial began. Courtrooms have a way of making time stand still. The wood panels, the echo of footsteps, the sharp sound of a judge's gavel. Carla's family filled the benches. So did the community. People who had carried this story in their hearts for nearly 5 decades. And sitting in the courtroom, with his hands folded and his face expressionless, was Glenn Samuel McCurley. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence. They explained the science behind the match. They showed the genealogy chart that traced the lineage straight to McCurley's family. And then they called a witness who had lived with this story longer than anyone else. Rodney McCoy, Carla's boyfriend on the night she was abducted. He walked slowly to the stand. Even after 46 years, the memory weighed heavily on his face. As he raised his hand to take the oath, the courtroom grew silent. Rodney recounted the night. The dance, the parking lot, the sudden attack, Carla's scream, and the helplessness he felt as everything was ripped away in seconds. His voice shook as he described how he tried to fight back, but couldn't. How he woke alone, bleeding and confused. How he lived with guilt and nightmares long after that night. He said, "I thought about her every day, every single day. It never left me." The jurors listened, some wiping tears. This wasn't just a case. It was a wound carried by an entire community. The defense argued that the DNA sample was too old. That contamination was possible. That McCurley had memory loss due to age. But the evidence was overwhelming. The DNA did not lie. The jury deliberated briefly. Their decision was unanimous. Guilty of capital murder. McCurley was sentenced to life in prison, a sentence he would serve until the end of his days. For Carla's family, it was not closure, because closure implies an ending. But it was justice. Justice that had been denied for decades. Justice that arrived long after her parents died. Justice that proved the truth will always rise, no matter how long it sleeps. Fort Worth police held a small ceremony, honoring Carla and the detectives who never gave up on her case. One officer said, "This was not a miracle. This was persistence, science, and love for a girl who should still be here." But the impact of her case went even further. Carla's story inspired Texas law enforcement to reopen numerous cold cases where DNA might still exist. Her case became a beacon of hope for families who had waited decades without answers. Each reopened file was a message that justice delayed is not always justice denied. Carla Walker, through her tragedy, helped bring light to others trapped in the darkness of forgotten cases. Carla's case did not simply end with a verdict. It became a turning point, a reminder that no case is too old, no evidence too fragile, and no question too impossible when science continues to evolve. Across Texas, detectives revisited shelves of dusty cold case boxes, files that had remained untouched for 30, 40, even 50 years. Some families, who once felt forgotten, received calls they never expected. A daughter's case reopened, a brother's case re-examined, a mother's case reassigned to a new team with new tools. Carla's story breathed life into countless others, because what solved her case wasn't only DNA, it was persistence, it was innovation, it was the belief that every victim matters, no matter how much time has passed. Throughout Fort Worth, people remembered where they were when Carla disappeared. Teachers who once taught her spoke of her kindness. Classmates recalled her smile. Friends said she always put others first. Her brother said that even when the world forgot, he never stopped believing someone would eventually open that case file again. And when detectives at last told him the truth had been found, he said he felt something he hadn't felt in over 4 decades. Peace. Not because the pain was gone, grief never disappears, but because he knew Carla's voice had finally been heard. In the years since the trial, Carla's name has been spoken in classrooms, in forensic labs, in police academies. Her case is now taught as a lesson in perseverance, innovation, and the power of DNA to bring justice across generations. Many detectives who worked on her case retired before the truth emerged. But their contributions, their interviews, their reports, their determination, were pieces of the puzzle that allowed modern science to succeed. One detective said, "We planted the seeds. The next generation brought the harvest." Carla's story stands as a testament to those who never gave up and those who refused to let her memory fade. For the Walker family, the verdict did not bring back the vibrant girl they loved, but it brought clarity. It brought truth. It brought a name to the question that had haunted them for almost half a century, and in that truth, they found strength. In that truth, they found justice. And in that justice, Carla's spirit finally found rest. Today, as cold cases continue to be reopened, solved, and understood, Carla's story remains a guiding light. A reminder that silence does not equal defeat, that time is not the enemy, and that every story deserves an ending built on truth. Carla Jan Walker was more than a headline, more than a case number, more than a file that gathered dust for 46 years. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a bright, gentle soul whose life was stolen far too soon. But through science, through perseverance, and through the dedication of those who refused to forget, her story was finally completed, not erased by time, not lost in the past, but carried into the present, where truth finally prevailed. Thank you for watching this episode of Cold Case Stories. If you value respectful, calm, and accurate storytelling based on real events and verified information, please consider subscribing. Your support helps us continue to give forgotten victims a voice and to bring new light to old mysteries. New episodes every week. We'll see you in the next file.